Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today with real thriving open source community and hearing about interesting projects. Today we're going to shine the light on information security, which is quite a top 3 executive priority. A bit about ourselves. So my name is Rajen Madan. I founded a firm called Leading Point. We work with a number of banks, insurers, and tech companies, and really helping change ways of working, getting them data ready, and implementing solutions as part of that mix. So that's something which born out of as a passion. I've been privileged to be in FS for 20 years, and during that time I've had the fortune to serve with a lot of these companies. With me is my co-founder, Thush.
Hi everyone, I'm Thush. So I've been solving complex data and operating model problems for financial services for 30 years now. So co-founded Leading Point with Rajen 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've been working hard solving these problems because they're ever present and ongoing.
Yeah, and we joined FINOS about 2 years ago. It really struck a chord with us, this open source, leverage the community, leverage the good work across community. And I think last year we were recognized as one of the top innovators with FINOS, and in particular we've driven forward 2 projects with FINOS, the Waltz and the AI and Cloud initiative. So that's kind of a bit of background. So let's focus on today. So the strapline is a little bit provocative. InfoSec for free. It's not free, but hey, look, you can get close to it. So what we want to discuss today, as we have been supporting a number of organizations in this space, is what are some of the foundational areas that firms should be looking at when they solve information security challenges, and what's the role of open source as part of that journey. Earlier today we've had a number of sessions, third-party supply chain, compliance, open source frameworks, etc. So there's a number of good work happening, but I think this is for us a bit of an untapped area, and it's worth also getting this participation from this room as well. What do you see as blockers, or what do you see as good ways that you've approached these challenges? So we're gonna focus on that. There's almost data points every week. There's hundreds every week when you do a scanning. We in the UK, even a couple of weeks back, we are still sort of grappling with the fallout of the NHS data breach. Quite significant, also touches real lives, real people, and that data is being sold on Snowflake. So the stakes are quite high, and it's interesting. This was in 2019, and Travelex, led to Travelex administration as a result of that. So even back in 2019, this was creating quite a bit of a challenge commercially as well as reputation. In banking, we are in the trust business, and those of us who bank. So we rely on these organizations to actually manage our trust contract in the right way. So I think the stakes are quite high with respect to InfoSec getting it wrong. What are some of the challenges? Again, I think what we have seen, the privacy laws have become a lot stringent over the last, track a similar timeline, 5 years. Regulators are finally getting to, grips with it. They want a lot more substantiation. They want a lot more scrutiny, evidence what you're saying that you're doing. So controlled substantiation. Earlier today as well, there's sessions around DORA and other sort of regulations as well. Those are somewhat scary, but they are requiring for organizations to go right into the detail around these topics. So the resilience requirements are also becoming more critical. Number of organizations, working on cloud initiatives, some very successful stories. But I guess the elephant in the room question is, just because you've put it in the cloud doesn't mean the data and the security problem goes away, right? If not, it adds more complexity. So you need the right framework and approach to deal with that at scale. And then a lot of firms experimenting with AI use cases. The quality of the underlying data and the controls you have on the underlying data are going to be even more important. Otherwise, it will end up being an AI governance, more sort of layering of processes and controls on top, but what's under the hood. So I think that's quite complicated for our stakeholders to get their head around. Thush, if you want to introduce a little bit on the response.
So how are firms dealing with this now? So right now there's a big increase in hiring at board level, so CISO roles. There's a lot of open roles now that are out there. The spends on information security programs is getting bigger, so on average now 30 million. So there's an increase in information security certification as well, so the ISO 27001. So we've helped firms with that. But that's every year, more and more firms. Because if you've got a choice of banking with a company that is ISO certified or is not, then that could impact your decision. So cybersecurity as well, there's a big skills gap. There's not a lot of knowledge out there embedded in firms. So there's training that's required. So more training courses are coming on board. And there was a FINOS survey in 23 last year, and talking about open source, and the respondents were saying they get more out of open source now than ever before. So there's a key part that open source software has to play in information security.
And it's quite a broad subject. What we are distilling it down to is the 5 areas here that we would like to touch upon today. So in terms of the foundational areas that we sort of suggest, or we've seen best practice, getting identity and access management right, looking at application portfolio management, so your underlying asset inventory, looking at your policy management, again, how various laws, jurisdictions, etc. are codified, looking at data access control, so different than application level controls, but that's where we see a lot of challenges. And the monitoring and response is the final one. So these are the 5 that we would like to touch upon today. I think we'll spend 2-3 minutes for each, and maybe at the end of each, if people have any viewpoints and questions, please interrupt us as we go along. If you want.
Okay, sorry. So when we talk about identity and access management, what we're talking about is access to applications in this case. So the first part of that is authentication, proving who you are. So typically this is done with passwords. You can also use biometrics now, and there's a move towards passwordless, so using authentication apps on your phone. So we're moving away from SMS messages as well. So those you can get quite easily hacked with those. So the next one is authorization. So you are who you say you are, but then what are you allowed to see, what you're allowed to do with which resource. So user management's important as well. So that repository, how do you manage the joiners for your company? So how do you know who's joined, who their manager is, what department they're in, which legal entity they're employed by? And this repository. So typically this is Active Directory. So in firms where we've worked, we've seen them use Active Directory, but also used it in silos. So you'll have one part of the business with their own Active Directory and another part with another, especially in larger firms where there's been mergers and acquisitions. So a large firm taking on lots of smaller firms, each with their own Active Directory, and that's never combined into one.
Yeah, it's interesting. What we've seen typically where we get stuck is the joiners leavers process, right? Your main data over there. The switch at the AD groups is quite a big challenge, right? We work with organizations that are probably thousands of AD groups, and that's quite complex to manage, and that's probably not the right answer. So I think that's where the attention is. A number of firms have got authentication, authorization sort of well underway, but I think that's where we see as some attention is sort of required.
So one example of open source software for IAM is Keycloak. So this offers single sign-on, integrates with Active Directory. So it's not your one-stop shop for IAM, but it gets you quite a way there. So you're still dealing with Active Directory, so if you've got those underlying silos of Active Directories, then you've still got that same problem. But the point is that there are open source tools to help with this. So the standard benefits of open source software apply here as well. So it's an active community as well, with a lot of contributors and commits in this one. The next one.
On application portfolio management, I guess the key thing to call out here is you're trying to capture all information around your applications, your infrastructure, your cloud, your batch, your shadow IT, lots of POCs going on. So one of the challenges we have seen organizations have a lot is they don't actually have a place. And it'd be interesting to hear from from people here, like if you're actually in your organizations, do you recognize what your asset master is? I think that for us is a pretty foundational thing. If you don't have that information on all your apps, your infrastructures, the organization around it, the roles around it, captured in detail, you actually don't get anything which is data driven. We were doing a work for one organization. They have about 12 data loss protection tools. So brilliantly covered by tools, but you actually say how much of your enterprise data is actually being picked up as part of that, and it's 4%. So you've got lots of tools, but actually, you've actually not implemented that. And you need the underlying data to actually provide that insight. And that you can only get from having this asset and master in the application portfolio side. This is one area actually where FINOS has actually delivered. So something that was developed at Deutsche Bank, and here in this room, we've got people who actually were part of the development, waving to Dave here, he was part of the founding team. But something that actually was developed over a number of years at an organization like Deutsche, committed, it works at serious scale. We've implemented that at a couple of organizations. We have enhanced the code base there. But you can actually see, you've got quite a significant commits, quite a number of contributors as well. And it's actually a way to get all your data in order, right? And you built all the adapters to it. So wherever you're picking up from, I think, Confluence and ServiceNow, and all the integrations are there, right? So rather than going after very expensive parades around, new shiny tools, etc., there's actually well-proven, well-trodden open source solutions which are quite fundamental to solving this information security, with some degree of provenance. So we certainly we found that a lot of success with that. And just to give people a sense of scale, right, where we've typically implemented that, is typically the estate is about 1,000 plus applications, 10 to 50,000 people, 50 plus org units, 150 data entities, and lots of information around underlying batch information. And also you get drills on how much of what's the attack surface on your payments landscape. Today in many organizations, that's a drill. It's a fire drill, you can't answer that properly. You get it into that, you can actually say, I've got X percentage of my payment stack under level 2 controls, Y percentage. So you need the underlying data. So I think that's quite fundamental. As a follow-up, we can share. There's a lot of material we have produced, and for education that we can share, and demos, and you can play with it as well. But that's, I think, one to definitely to highlight as a key one.
Okay, so the next one's policy management. So when we talk about policy, it's important to understand what regulations there are. So that's the first step. But then, based on your own business, how do those regulations apply to you and what you do? So these are your obligations. And then from your obligations, then you can define what the policy is. So what you're obliged to do. So policy needs to be written in such a way that it's enforceable. So this is what we're going to do, and then you can write your procedures, say this is how we're going to do it. So the one thing that often is a gap is the enforcement of policy. So it's fine having a policy, and every company's got lots of policies, but how do they track that policy against what is actually going on in the business, the actual operational processes? So there's a big disconnect there, partly because those policies are just Word documents. You can just go and download a slavery policy or whatever, but you don't know how that is being used in your everyday business. So one open source tool is Open Policy Agent. So this treats policy as code, so it's got its own quite straightforward language where you can write policies, but then you can link them, your policies then, with your code base. So the next one is probably the most important one, around data access control. So data access control and IAM are often confused. So if you think of IAM as access to applications, data access control is access to the data within those applications. So you might be given access to a particular reporting tool, but without data access control, you can see everything. So that's it's good that you're restricted to a particular application, but it's bad that you can still see everything. So the first point in here is the actual is the request itself. So who is making the request? What resource are they looking at? Is it a piece of data? Is it some application that they want access to? And what do they want to do with it? Do they want to view it, amend it? What rights do they have to do that? So this is where the policy part comes in now. So you need to know the policy to say what this person can and cannot do with that data. So different access control types. So typically you could do it based on their role. So a junior claims handler might be able to see information about all the claims in aviation, which is their line of business, but no other lines of business. You might get a head of region that could see all lines of business, but not see any PII information, for example. So you could base it on role, but you could also base it on attribute, so attribute-based access control, which is a lot more flexible. So role is just another attribute in that. And the most important bit is the enforcement of that. So how do you make sure that that request is being controlled? So if I'm a Italian aviation claims handler, I only see Italian aviation claims. I'm not seeing US construction claims.
I think on this one, if you just go back one slide, I think this one is quite fundamental, especially where a number of organizations have got platforms and data lakes, etc. So you're trying to empower your data science team, you're trying to empower your reporting, all the analytics layers, you're trying to empower that. But what you're using, most organizations, is just at an application level and a mixed match of some AD groups to actually administer that. And what we have seen is this is the single, I think there was a stat that 60%, 70% of UK firms are still not GDPR compliant. Right? This actually speaks to the heart of it, because you're not able to demonstrate that principle of least privilege. I should not be able to see this data, right? So it's going down that layer below, deeper than the application level. So what we have seen again here is the ability to actually codify and develop the roles and rules that you need for different jurisdictions, for different use cases, for different personas. That actually is kind of the first sort of part, and then you can actually see, okay, how would you actually technically implement that, right? Whether you're going to do that at the reporting layer, because it's pointless having all sorts of controls at a reporting layer when your data science team can just take extracts of the data, right? So you actually compromise there already. So this data access control is one where most organizations are struggling with. It's not a high-tech play, right? It's not you need to go and buy lots of expensive. There are tools, they're open source as well, but this is where it's about the data, it's less about the technical sort of aspect. I just wanted to throw it open as well, any sort of insights, any questions, do any of you relate to these topics? is it all solved in where you work? Is it, like, anyone want to comment on where you see the challenges from your experience?
I do have a comment. So you listing individual tools that implement those aspects, but the challenge is going to link all these tools together so they will work together. For example, there's no point having a role if that role cannot be applied, in that particular layer. So are you going to cover later on the presentation how those tools work together, or is that a challenge that you've seen yourself?
It's a really good question, and it is a challenge, right? But the question is that a really technology challenge, or if you get all of that data in the right framework implemented, then is it making sure you have an integration framework, a bit of a glue around it, or do you actually think there's a real technical gap here?
Well, first of all, the tools need to talk to each other. So what is a role needs to be, all the tools need to understand what role is and have the same understanding. Because if you read some of the reports, incident reports about where we have security issues, it is all publicized. You see that most of them, well, not most, but some of them at least, is because the interpretation of the security rules is different across the different business, so the system. And that is a challenge.
Yeah.
So what you're covering here is touching upon that challenge. You show us several tools together. If those tools do not interoperate with each other, then you have potential security problem.
I think part of that's having a good data glossary. So that definition of these individual roles is key. So then at least all of the tools can read from the glossary, whether it's Calibra or something else. They can read from it and say, right, this is what this particular role means in this organisation. But again, having that central glossary is a challenge in itself. Trying to get one line of business to agree with just another line of business is tough.
Yeah, we tried to solve that for one of the large organizations, like say this room, it was City. And we were asked to look at how 100 jurisdictions at City consolidate all their security requirements and their regulatory requirements. And that was a non-trivial ask. So there we actually went through defining more, as Tush said, the underlying taxonomy, like what is an actual law, what is an actual guideline, what's an actual, what is mandatory enforcement versus what is a guideline. So that was quite a painstaking data effort. Once they did it, then actually they could pick any sort of, they went with one particular RegTech, but they could pick any sort of technical. We still saw the challenge was data standardization and having a framework. So there's not an easy answer, like from that point of view. Sorry, please.
I think one point building on that I've seen as well is it's not just the systems implemented in your technology platforms, it's also thinking about your enterprise systems. So like your HR database and things like that, because often your HR and your payroll systems are more up to date sometimes on role changes, and everyone likes to avoid the modify process in our back, but that's where the vulnerabilities often exist.
That's a really good point, and I think, David, like what you mentioned, we've seen that as an area, just gone and bought like a really interesting data tool like Calibra 2-3 years in, but that is not actually become operational. So the quality of data is actually not recent, and that actually is creating a lot of this noise as well in one of the organizations we're working with. So you're absolutely right. It's not just about the tech. It's how you're actually implementing it in the underlying.
Okay. So yeah, one of those tools that we've got is Cerbos. So again, it's a technical tool, but it does sit between so if you're thinking of a reporting tool, so Power BI, Tableau, and a data lake, data warehouse, you can have access to that Power BI application and then see all of the data in your warehouse. Where Cerbos fits in the middle to actually intercept the requests. So someone's saying, I want to see everything. And then what is returned is this user can only see this subsection of that. So it will apply the filtering and the masking of data as well. Okay.
I think the final, just to, the sort of final points to highlight are where you've got all of this, but it touches also something that you raised, like you need to have like a proper reporting framework and a monitoring framework. So this is, again, this is less about necessarily tech, but more about having the process. So when we've go and implement ISO 27001, this is quite a key requirement, that you need to have made decisions as an organization, who's responsible for what, if I detect something, where am I going with it, how does this go into the external reporting loop as well, because the penalties are quite different if you report something that you've detected or self-detected in 24 hours versus 48 hours or 72 hours. So this is more about getting the actual process and getting that loop around. I think this is also where we're seeing some interesting sort of machine learning and patterns as well. If you get this information, you can actually start to see some patterns in the monitoring data. So that's where at least we are going with it. It doesn't need to be just a PowerPoint packs or like Confluence. You can actually turn this data into a more an efficient process from a monitoring point of view. One of the solutions we have come across is Wazoo. It's quite, it is able to log changes, it is able to detect intrusions and vulnerability as well, and create the CV reports as well. So again, quite significant number of commits, 300 GitHubs committing to it. So there is, again, these are something you don't need to necessarily go and pay. You can actually trial and use in the organization. Just an open question, I guess, in your organizations where you operate, what would be the posture towards adopting open source towards something like InfoSec? Because when we go and speak to, it depends on the organization again, but when we go and speak about open source, the first reaction people say, but that's not secure. So it's almost counterintuitive to say, well, why would you go open source to actually do something with security? So are there any, I don't know, from experience, or what in your organization would be a response if you said, I'm going to actually use something open source, I'm going to use the community, I'm going to use something that one organization built? It would be really cool to hear, any thoughts on that as well. Or are you aware of anything open source in your organizations, any open source project or?
Well, I cannot represent my organization for that, but everyone is using so much open source tools. So the real question is, would you like to use open source knowingly or not knowingly?
Okay.
Because 90% of stuff is open source, as Log4j has proven.
Yeah.
And some organizations, well, FINOS itself actually shows that quite a number of organizations are interested.
Yeah.
And I was once attending, speaking to a senior person from a known market player in investments, and asked, why are you so heavy on open source? They have high percentage of open source developers than Google, I think. And they said that, look, if you take this project as a branch of Apache Spark, as a fork, and we start developing to make our custom version, 5 years, we cannot compete with the market. 5 years from now, we will lose. It's better to work together. So if there is a reason, if developers can explain why they want, cybersecurity professionals, if you can explain why you want this, and if you work out who to blame if something goes wrong, why not?
Interesting. Anyone else from open source?
Again, I cannot speak to my organization, but I can provide an opinion. Saying that open source is insecure is like saying closed source is more secure. Right? We have plenty of evidence that this is not the case. And the problem is when that becomes evident, it is in big proportions. Right? So we all heard about issues with Windows and Macros, etc. So I think this is the wrong statement by definition. It is more accurate to say that open source security is more visible. Right? And when you approach the problem from that perspective, essentially the question to the organizations become, do you want to have visibility of the issues, or you want someone to hide them from you? But if you're hiding, you have to be comfortable with the risks. So are you comfortable with the risks but not seeing security issues? I think that's a better framing of the question.
It's a really interesting way you frame, definitely. And I think this is where we are also, working with FINOS to elevate for certainly information security, the projects, get more projects into FINOS which actually are solving this, create the communication, for the community around that. That's definitely the direction of travel. I think we just summarized. So big benefits of focusing on the foundations as well as open source. Costs, some sponsors we work with, they are very blunt. They would love to have this sophisticated explained, but they're like, is this a cost mutualization play? Yes, tick. Okay, I'm happy to experiment that. For some, actually, the open source is also a way to sort of detach that vendor dependence, because you get too attached to a particular paradigm and then you can't navigate to others as well. So I think that vendor independence is a good statement to get that. The community, so we've been surprised as well, as been working in this space, the number of people who are sometimes out of passion or outside hours who are actually helping solve the problems for the community. That's actually really good. It brings out, the best there. I think the point you just mentioned there, the transparency, so make it more visible. It's actually more visible. That's quite a key sort of selling point. And I think, being open source doesn't mean that you're stuck. It actually means that you're creating the capability inside the organization and you can adapt what you build. So, it's yours. It's how you want to develop that capability. So with that, we'll thank everyone for your time, and really enjoyed coming here and sharing some thoughts. Thank you.